Bonjour tout le monde. Hello everyone. This is an important time and it requires important measures. That's why Canada's and Canadians have been stepping up here at COP26. It's a milestone. Since when we met in Paris, we're facing big challenges as communities, as countries, and as a world. And it's time for some big solutions. We laid out plans to get to net zero by 2050 at home. We've made progress with partners to keep 1.5 alive as a goal we need to reach. Chez nous, on a mis un prix sur la pollution qu'on a défendu devant la Cour suprême et même créé un consensus parmi les Canadiens. Il faut avancer sur la tarification du carbone. On a amené des investissements records dans le transport collectif, dans les énergies propres. On a fait énormément en partenariat avec les peuples autochtones et les partenaires à travers le pays comme les provinces pour protéger nos océans, pour protéger nos terres et notre biodiversité. We're going to keep moving forward at home. On emissions, we've committed to put a cap and begin to cut emissions from oil and gas production. We're the first major oil and gas producing nation to do that. We committed to reduce methane emissions by at least 30% by 2030, and in particular, reduce oil and gas methane emissions by 75% by 2030. On electricity, we've committed to phasing out coal-fired electricity by 2030. We're going to ensure that all new vehicle sales are zero-emission vehicles and that we have a net zero grid by 2035. This is something we've said a number of times, and people have remarked upon here at COP, that we're not just saying we need to move forward as a world, we ought to do things. Canada is showing that we are doing things. We're making big decisions at home and encouraging people around the world to do more as well. Because climate change doesn't recognize borders. At COP, I've spoken to dozens and dozens of leaders driving ambition, deepening cooperation. Today, with partners like the IMF, World Bank, and the World Trade Organization, we're calling to bringing in carbon pricing to triple it on emissions, up from about 21% of emissions covered by a price on pollution around the world to get to 60% covered by a price on pollution by 2030. We're working with Germany and other partners on reaching that $100 billion a year commitment that was made at Paris that is as yet unfulfilled. We're getting close. There's still more work to do that Stephen and others are going to keep pushing on over the coming days. Notre planète est à un moment critique. Les progrès des derniers jours qu'on a vus au G20, qu'on a vus ici à COP avec des engagements par différents chefs de gouvernement, c'est un bon début, mais ce n'est qu'un début. Les gens à travers la planète nous regardent, les travailleurs, les peuples autochtones, les jeunes sont en train d'exiger encore plus de leadership des dirigeants de la planète, des pays d'un bout à l'autre de ce monde. Et c'est exactement ce sur quoi le Canada se concentre. Notre avenir et celui de nos enfants est en jeu. They've been past 5 days extremely busy for our Canadian delegation. From our first stop in the Netherlands, where we talked about trade and shared values and the work we need to continue to do with strong allies on multilateralism and promoting democracy, to the G20 in Italy, where we brought the world together to recognize 1.5 as a target, to commit to reaching net zero by the middle of the century. These are things that we're going to have to continue to push on. It involved working on vaccines and global supply chains and economic growth and strengthening our support for people who are struggling with affordability at the same time as we show leadership on the big issues that the world is facing. So from climate action to vaccines to progressive trade, we focused on what matters to Canadians: clean air and good jobs, beating COVID-19, and doing our part to build a stronger, healthier world. It's been a busy number of days, but Canada has been there to do the hard work and to continue doing the hard work over the coming days to build a better future, not just for Canadians, but for everyone. C'est le travail que nous devons faire, c'est le travail que nous allons faire. Merci.
Premier ministre, on va commencer la période de questions pour 20 minutes. Une question, un suivi. One question, one follow-up. Starting with David Cochrane from CBC News.
Hi there, Prime Minister. I wanted to touch on your session this morning on pushing for a global minimum price on carbon. You had like-minded allies there from Europe, multilateral organizations who are clearly supportive of this, but missing biggest traded partner, biggest economy, the United States. A national carbon pricing plan is not part of what Joe Biden is proposing. So how big of an obstacle is that to achieving this goal?
I think we all recognize that the biggest obstacle is figuring out how we're all going to live up to our commitments to arrive at net zero emissions by 2050, how we're going to meet our 2030 targets. And we know there are many different approaches that every country is going to have to take to reduce emissions, to decarbonize their economy, to get to net zero. And carbon pricing is one of the most effective and cheapest ways to get there. Economists know that it's one of the most efficient ways of doing it, and it's an extremely powerful tool that incentivizes businesses and consumers to make smarter choices. Making sure that pollution isn't free anywhere is a very smart and powerful idea. Now, countries are beginning to see that what we've done in Canada and what has been done elsewhere is extremely powerful for reducing emissions. And we're excited about the interest that international organizations and other countries are looking at what we've done with. So there's lots of work to do, but the important thing is reducing those emissions. And I am very optimistic that as people look at the hard work of reducing emissions, they'll realize that not putting a price on pollution in their jurisdictions is going to mean having to do more expensively, in more complex ways in other parts of their economy. And that's what's so appealing about carbon pricing. Tout à fait. Je pense que le grand défi auquel on fait face, c'est de réduire les émissions jusqu'à la carboneutralité en 2050. Et évidemment, il y a différents moyens, différents outils qu'on peut utiliser. Mais on sait aussi qu'un des outils les plus puissants pour le faire, le plus efficace pour le faire, c'est de mettre un prix sur la pollution, de s'assurer que de polluer n'est plus gratuit nulle part. Alors, les différents pays vont prendre leurs propres décisions sur comment ils vont et quels outils ils vont utiliser. Mais nous, on est là pour démontrer que ça se fait de façon directe, qui aide les gens et qui va fonctionner pour limiter les émissions. Et je sais qu'il y a bien des pays qui vont être très intéressés par l'exemple, le leadership du Canada et d'autres pays qui sont déjà allés de l'avant avec la tarification du carbone.
Prime Minister, between the G20 and here, we've seen some of the other big economies, China, Russia, India, either holding out or not showing up on a lot of the initiatives you're trying to make progress on. The Americans are here, they're engaged. I mean, do you think you can convince America to move towards a full carbon pricing regime in all 50 states?
What I'm pointing out, David, is that we have an extremely powerful tool that is straightforward, that everyone can understand. We put a price on pollution to make sure that polluting isn't free, and consumers and businesses have the predictability to be able to make choices and investments that will reduce our emissions. There are lots of different tools that can be used, and every country will pick their options. But what we can do is show that it's powerful, it's straightforward, and it's impactful. To do that, and that's what we're going to continue to do. Look, a few years ago, nobody would have even imagined that we could set a global minimum corporate tax, and suddenly we have. These are things that are the right ideas that when their time has come, people start to adopt, and that's what we're going to be pushing very hard around the world on.
Bonjour, M. Trudeau, Madeleine Blais-Morin, Radio-Canada. Vous avez vanté ce matin le modèle, justement, de la taxe sur le carbone, de redonner de l'argent dans le portefeuille des Canadiens, mais ce n'est pas un modèle qui est en vigueur partout au pays. Donc, à mesure que le prix va augmenter, vous parlez de 170 $ la tonne en 2030, est-ce que ça va devenir plus difficile de ne pas avoir un modèle uniforme au pays?
Je pense que ce qui compte le plus, c'est l'impact. On sait très bien qu'il y a différentes façons de mettre un prix sur la pollution. Il y a des bourses de carbone, il y a la tarification directe. L'important, c'est de s'assurer que ce n'est plus gratuit de polluer et de s'assurer que c'est un système équivalent. Les différents systèmes sont équivalents les uns aux autres à travers le pays et éventuellement à travers le monde. On sait très bien que tous les pays ne vont pas avoir exactement la même approche. On n'a pas tous les mêmes économies, les mêmes défis. Mais si on peut se mettre d'accord sur des standards, sur un impact semblable, comme on a pu faire au Canada, où différentes provinces ont des différentes façons de faire, mais on peut s'assurer que l'équivalence est là. Et nous allons continuer de travailler pour s'assurer que l'impact de ce prix sur la pollution est pareil à travers le pays.
Après les 48 heures que vous avez passées, puis après le sommet du G20, quel est votre niveau de confiance que le 1,5 degré, c'est encore possible de le respecter, cet objectif-là?
Je sais que c'est encore possible. Mais je sais aussi que ça va exiger pas juste tout le travail qu'on est en train de faire, mais ça va exiger encore plus de travail. C'est pour ça que nous, comme pays, mais d'autres aussi, sont en train de se pousser les uns les autres pour en faire plus. La COP26, c'est un moment extrêmement important, mais c'est un moment, un milestone parmi tant d'autres. Nous allons devoir être ambitieux ici. Et l'année prochaine, nous allons continuer d'avoir besoin d'être ambitieux et de continuer à en faire plus pour atteindre ce 1,5 qui est si nécessaire.
In English?
I think one of the things we recognize is that we're going to need to be continuing to push our levels of ambition. What we're doing by pushing hard now and pushing on the development of new solutions, of technologies, of new ways of growing our economy, of decarbonizing, is going to allow us to continue to be even more ambitious. What we decide right here is going to be important, but as we continue to push and be even more ambitious as we support people with good jobs in our communities and around the world, as we support the developing world with the need to reduce emissions and provide energy for their citizens in ways that don't contribute to accelerated greenhouse climate change. These are the things we need to do. So yes, I am confident we're going to be able to stay on that track for 1.5 because I am confident we are going to continue to keep pushing ourselves and each other to be more and more ambitious.
Mia Rabson from the Canadian Press. The President of the European Commission talked about border carbon adjustments that they're planning to do. Just curious in terms of preventing carbon leakage or sort of pushing for this global carbon price that you're talking about, what role could those play in Canada, and are you seriously considering it?
We know, for example, that Canada produces some of the cleanest aluminum in the world. What we're doing right now in different parts of the country and what we're innovating with ELYSIS, which is a not just energy, but inputs and processes for net zero aluminum, is something that is extraordinarily valuable to discerning consumers around the world. But we are right now competing with aluminum around the world that can be sold at even cheaper prices because it is done in dirtier ways with significantly lower labor standards. I don't think that's the kind of world we want, where people who do the right things the right way get penalized, and people who do the wrong things the wrong way get advantages. So all we're looking at and what the conversations are all about right now, whether it's a global minimum standard for a price on pollution or border adjustments or what have you, is a way of making sure a level playing field and that those who are stepping up and doing everything they can to reduce their emissions, to demonstrate new technologies that will be effective, are not penalized before they can even begin. On sait par exemple que l'aluminium fait au Canada, au Québec, est l'aluminium le plus propre au monde. Et une fois qu'on a la technologie Hélicis, dans laquelle on est en train d'investir, ça va être encore plus. Mais sur le marché mondial, cet aluminium canadien est en train de compétitionner avec de l'aluminium fait ailleurs, avec des processus plus nocifs pour l'environnement, avec des standards de travail plus bas. Et donc, nous sommes à un désavantage parce qu'on est en train de faire de meilleures choses pour l'environnement, pour les citoyens. Je pense que tout le monde peut comprendre qu'on a besoin d'avoir un système qui reconnaît et valorise le travail que font les pays, les compagnies, qui sont en train de faire les bonnes choses pour les bonnes raisons, et non les décourager en permettant à ceux qui ne sont pas en train de montrer du leadership en matière d'environnement de prendre des avantages. Donc, c'est ça, ces conversations que nous sommes en train d'avoir, et il y a plusieurs mécanismes, que ce soit un standard minimum pour une tarification du carbone, que ce soit des ajustements à la frontière. Il y a toutes sortes de façons de le faire, et ces conversations continuent. Mais le principe, je pense qu'on peut s'entendre que ceux qui font les bonnes choses de la bonne façon devraient être reconnus et valorisés pour ce qu'ils sont en train de faire.
Is there more your government should be doing to make the U.S. aware of the role Canada's critical minerals could play in fixing some of the supply chain problems? Did you raise that with President Biden over the last few days? And did you also raise the issue of their proposed tax credit on electric vehicles and the impact it'll have on Canada?
Over the past number of days, I've had many interactions with President Biden. One of them, the supply chain event at the G20 in Rome, was specifically focused on things like the two issues you brought up. On critical minerals, for example, Canada and Australia, who is sitting beside me, have access to large numbers of the critical minerals that are needed in the production of batteries and the production of modern technologies. But again, the challenge is the extraction and the processing of those in our countries is more costly because we have higher environmental standards, higher labor standards than the countries that are right now busy cornering the market on those sorts of productions. So the conversation we had is about, well, how much is it of value to developed countries to have a secure, friendly source of those critical minerals that are done in better and more responsible ways, even though, obviously, they may be a little more expensive. And having those conversations about, it's worth it, particularly as we come through COVID, to make sure we have strong supply chains, supply lines that are reliable and not subject to coercive practices or manipulation. These are the conversations we're having. And on the auto sector, the fact that Canada is as committed as we are to producing zero-emission vehicles, that we're already seeing changes in our auto industry, that our auto industry is so tremendously interwoven with that of the United States and has been for 50 years, means that I know we're going to be able to work together to develop electric cars and to make sure that Canada, as the #1 export destination for cars made in the United States, continues to be able to work hand in hand in our auto sector with the United States, including on electric vehicles.
Prime Minister, Michael Couture with Global National. There's a high cost to coming to summits like this one, considering all of the emissions, the carbon footprint, and the risk of COVID-19 for not only you, but your entire delegation. So I was wondering, Was it worth the lack of results that you're leaving with today on climate action?
Mike, I totally disagree with the premise of your question. What we've actually seen today, whether it's the commitment to reduce our oil and gas methane emissions by 70% by 2030, whether it's the work that we've been doing with Germany to push the world towards that $1 billion in $100 billion in climate financing that the world so desperately needs, whether it's being able to, as you saw this morning, promote carbon pricing as a powerful, effective, and politically saleable way to reduce emissions in the most efficient way. In the dozens and dozens of conversations I've had with world leaders on everything from better infrastructure for Smile Island developing states like the Caribbean that are faced with increasing storms but need to build climate resilient infrastructure and decrease their emissions, whether it's conversations about the climate crisis in sub-Saharan Africa with some of our African partners, whether it's working hand in glove with Asian partners on investments in infrastructure, in protecting our oceans. This is the world coming together to pay heed to the greatest crisis that our citizens are calling us to do more on, and quite frankly, our citizens and future generations will suffer from if we don't act decisively. So yes, it is a good thing that the world be coming together here this week in Glasgow.
To follow up, I just wanted to ask you, the Liberal platform had promised to end coal exports from and through Canada by 2030. Your news release yesterday dropped the reference to exports through Canada. So are you going to end exports of U.S. coal through Canada by 2030?
We've committed to end thermal coal exports by 2030. The details are being worked out by our Environment Minister, by our Natural Resources Minister, but we made very strong commitments in our campaign, commitments that we've delivered on just a few months later today, whether it's the 75% on oil and gas methane reductions, whether it's capping and cutting emissions in the oil and gas sector, which we are the first major oil and gas producing country to do that, or whether it's leading the world on carbon pricing. These are things that we laid out to Canadians we would do. Just a few months later, we're doing them.
Hi, Prime Minister. JP Tasker from CBC News. Your new Environment Minister is an outspoken critic of nuclear energy. He has called for nuclear power plants in this country to be shut down. Do you still see a role for nuclear energy as we start to transition to cleaner energy in Canada? Is there still, should we still rely on nuclear power to get us through?
I think we're going to need every different alternative to be pursued and explored fully as we try to get off fossil fuels as a world in time to prevent more than 1.5 degrees in global temperatures. And that means investing more in wind, investing more in solar, and yes, exploring nuclear. We have a number of provinces that are working hard on small modular reactors, and I'm not going to prejudge the outcome of what will be the right energy mix for us in the coming decades, and I'm certain it's going to continue to evolve. So I'm not taking anything off the table. Canada has a strong history in nuclear energy. And we will continue to look at all ways to make sure we're preventing this planet from hitting the catastrophic climate change level.
Just on a totally separate topic, as you know, the Canadian flag has been at half-mast on federal buildings now for 7 months. Remembrance Day is next week. What's your plan? When will you start to raise those flags on federal buildings?
We continue to work very closely with partners, with Indigenous peoples, with communities across the country. There is an understanding of how important it is to be able to lower the flags on Remembrance Day to mark our veterans, to mark people including Indigenous peoples who've stepped up to fight for Canadian values and paid the ultimate sacrifice. And I am confident that the conversations with Indigenous leadership on making sure we are able to lower the flags once again on November 11th will come at the right solution. Okay. Je sais que c'est important pour tous les Canadiens, incluant les peuples autochtones, de pouvoir se souvenir et honorer ceux qui ont fait le sacrifice ultime en servant leur pays, en se battant pour nos valeurs, pour nos principes en tant que pays. Donc, je sais que le 11 novembre, nous allons pouvoir baisser le drapeau canadien à travers le pays. Comment on va y arriver? On est en train justement de parler de façon très proche avec les peuples autochtones pour s'assurer que ce soit fait de la bonne façon.
Hello, Heather Schofield from the Toronto Star. As you said off the top, you've signed on to quite a few commitments here. And, you know, deforestation, it looks like it will touch to the heart of, you know, British Columbia's economy, New Brunswick, Quebec. Your zero emissions vehicles touches the auto industry in Ontario. The oil and gas cap and the methane reductions obviously touch the oil sands very, very closely. Are we ready for this?
I think Canadians know that the world is changing. Our economy is changing. And quite frankly, climate change is a reality that is going to transform our lives, whether we reach 1.5 degree or not. Canadians also know that even as we face changes and transformations in the way we live, work, and play, there is also a tremendous opportunity to lead, to be successful, to create solutions that are beneficial to Canadians and indeed to the entire world. Canadians know how to step up. We know how to work hard. We know how to innovate. We know how to create solutions. From energy workers in Alberta to scientists in Quebec and Ontario to loggers right across the country. In every corner of the country, there are people working hard to build a better future for themselves, for their kids, for their community, for their country. And right now, we're seeing the country come together to say, this is our moment. This is the moment where, as Canadians, and indeed as a world, we need to make that transformation happen. And it's so much better to be leading it than to be dragged along behind.
So, given all those commitments, is it time then to increase your ambition and go above the 40 to 45% by 2030?
Every step of the way, we haven't just placed ambitious targets forward. We've demonstrated a concrete plan to achieve those targets. By bringing in a price on pollution early on in our mandate, we were able to be confident that we were going to surpass the 30% reduction target that we inherited from the previous government. And as we saw our capacity to go even beyond it, we set a new target of 36% that we knew we'd be able to achieve. And now, as it is very clear we're going to be able to achieve that 36% and beyond, we've set another target of 40 to 45%. And we're going to continue to look to increase our ambition. But every step of the way, we're not going to do what so many governments in Canada's past and indeed around the world have continued to do, which is set targets without a concrete plan to meet them. I look forward to presenting even more ambitious targets in the future, but we will ensure that before we set new targets, we are able to achieve the ambitious targets that we've just set out here at COP.
Glenn McGregor, CTV News. In your response to my colleague Mike, you listed all the things that you think were accomplished over the past 2 days. I can't believe you think this was a complete success. What things that you were hoping to see here in Glasgow didn't happen, and can you explain maybe why they didn't happen?
Well, first of all, Glenn, this is day 2 of a 2-week conference of the parties. The work that is going to be done over the coming 2 weeks by extraordinary Canadian delegations, by our Environment Minister and by the many other ministers who are coming to lend a hand, is going to be difficult. but is going to be incredibly important. And what we were able, I think, as Canadians and as partners to many countries around the world to set as a level of ambition, as a level of urgency to dive into those negotiations that will finally come out of COP26, I think is off to a great start. But you're right to be cynical, Glenn, because we've seen hard things not get done in the past, but that's no reason to not continue to believe that we can push harder and bring more people along and rise to the moment that, quite frankly, citizens around the world are expecting of us collectively.
You say you are hopeful of raising the targets, and you also say that carbon pricing, in your view, is the most efficient way of hitting those targets. Is there a linkage there? Could you see a point where Canada's carbon pricing increases above and beyond the current rate that it's rising at? Sweden's at, I think, 130 US, far ahead of us, where we will be for many years. Do you see in the next, in the short term, medium term, long term, increasing the speed with which or the rate at which you're pricing carbon?
One of the key elements of carbon pricing and what makes it so successful as a measure to drive down emissions is the predictability, is that companies that are looking at investments that will be impacting the way they do business over the next decade, over the next 2 decades, want to know what the best way to invest in now. So the fact that we've set a very ambitious track for our carbon price that rises by $15 a year, all the way up to $170 a year, $170 a ton by 2030, is exactly the kind of strong, clear price signal that investors in Canada and businesses in Canada will know that it's worthwhile to keep emissions down, it's worthwhile to innovate, and for people around the world, it's worthwhile to invest in Canada because we are serious about tackling climate change. We've laid out the trajectory until 2030. Of course, as we approach 2030, I'm sure there will be more conversations by future governments about what that trajectory needs to be and looks like in the coming decades. But we won't be the only ones in the world having that conversation by then, because we're very optimistic we're going to be able to get to tripling the amount of emissions covered by carbon pricing in the coming years.
We'll take one last question.
It's John Woodside, Canada's National Observer. I want to follow up on this deforestation pledge. This summer really showed the threat posed to Canadian forests by wildfires, and with a certain amount of warming locked in, these are only going to get worse. We also know that wildfires are made worse by monocropping and glyphosate spraying. So what, if anything, will Canada do to make sure the quality of forests are protected, not just the quantity of trees?
Excellent, excellent questions. Canada is home to one of the largest continuous forests in the world, and we have a responsibility to protect it. We've seen the impact of global temperatures rising, that are rising twice as fast in Canada as elsewhere in the world, on those forests, and we have a responsibility to be stewards of them. I'm happy to turn it over to Minister Guilbeault, who was there at the forests announcement today while I was at an oceans announcement, to talk about how we're going to make that a reality. Stephen?
Merci, Monsieur le Premier Ministre. Thank you. I think the approach is really changing in the way we look at forestry and linking it to obviously the climate crisis, but also biodiversity. So I think these things go hand in hand, and I think this is the new approach that we're seeing on the global scale, and certainly an approach in Canada that we're moving towards in partnership with Indigenous peoples, and certainly the very ambitious targets that Canada has set in terms of protecting our landmass and our oceans as well. We're amongst the leaders in the world that have made that commitment for 25 by 25 and 30 by 30. But obviously, it has to be done right from a biodiversity perspective.
And just as a follow-up, I just want to switch gears just a little bit with Trans Mountain, with both of you here. So Trans Mountain, it's not even halfway built. It's far over budget. The energy regulator forecasts show the demand isn't there, it's being built to move a harmful product, and the International Energy Agency is practically screaming there can be no more fossil fuel projects in a 1.5 degree world. So, I'd like to know, why should other countries here take Canada seriously when it claims climate leadership, when it won't take decisive action on something this night and day?
First of all, as a world, we continue to need fossil fuels, and will, for a few more years. While we do, it's important that we innovate, that we transform our energy mix to reduce the amount of carbon emitted, both in the production and the transport of those fossil fuels that are still necessary. These are issues that we have grappled with, that Canadians grappled with in the last 2 elections, and continue to understand that we need to move forward on fighting climate change and managing the transition as effectively and ambitiously as we possibly can. That's what Canadians have trusted this government to do, and that's what we will continue to do. Merci beaucoup.
Conférence de presse d'aujourd'hui. This is what ends today's press conference.